Before the story begins, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more emotional and surprising stories ahead. And now let's dive into today's story. Mom, where do you keep the house documents? Those were the first words my son spoke to me after I was admitted to the hospital, and in that moment, something inside me quietly shifted. I had expected concern. I had expected a simple question about how I was feeling, whether the doctors had good news, whether I needed anything from home. Instead, Jason stood beside my hospital bed holding a cup of coffee he had clearly bought for himself, while his eyes wandered around the room as if he were searching for something more valuable than the woman lying in it. My name is Evelyn Parker. I am 72 years old, a widow, and until that week I still believed that family meant showing up for people, not for possessions. The hospital room smelled faintly of disinfectant and fresh linens. Outside the window, a gray spring rain tapped softly against the glass. I had been admitted after experiencing chest discomfort that my doctor wanted to monitor. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was serious enough to keep me there for observation. The nurses were kind. The doctors were reassuring. Yet the coldest feeling I experienced during those days didn't come from any medical test. It came from the people who shared my last name. Within 24 hours of my admission, both of my children appeared. Melissa arrived carrying flowers that still had the grocery store receipt attached to them. Jason arrived with Rachel, his wife. They all smiled. They all spoke gently. But none of them seemed interested in me. Their questions circled the same subjects again and again. Had I updated my will recently? Did I still have the spare key hidden where I always kept it? Was I planning to sell the house someday? At first, I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe they were worried about practical matters. Maybe they were simply trying to help. That explanation comforted me for about an hour. Then Rachel asked whether I had organized my financial records. Melissa wondered aloud what would happen to the property if I ever needed long-term care. Jason asked if the insurance papers were still in the filing cabinet downstairs. I noticed something else too. When the nurse entered the room to check my blood pressure, the conversation stopped immediately. Smiles appeared. Concern suddenly filled their voices. The moment she left, the questions returned. I lay there listening carefully, saying very little. Years of motherhood had taught me something important. People often reveal their true intentions when they think you trust them completely. By the end of that afternoon, I realized nobody had asked how much pain I was in. Nobody had asked whether I was frightened. Nobody had even asked what the doctor had said about my condition. They wanted information. They wanted access. They wanted certainty about the future of a house I had spent 40 years paying for. As evening settled outside my window and the hallway lights dimmed, I watched my children leave the room together. They thought I was resting. They thought I wasn't paying attention. But for the first time, I began wondering whether they had come to the hospital for their mother at all. That night, after my children left, the room felt strangely peaceful. The steady hum of the air conditioning replaced the carefully rehearsed concern I had listened to all afternoon. I lay awake staring at the ceiling tiles, thinking about how quickly everything had changed. Or perhaps it had not changed at all. Perhaps I was only seeing it clearly for the first time. 8 years earlier, when my husband Daniel passed away, I believed the hardest part of my life was beginning. We had been married for 43 years. We raised our children in the same two-story house on Maple Ridge Drive. Every creaking floorboard carried a memory. Every room held a chapter of our family history. After Daniel was gone, the silence in that house became something I had to learn to live with. At first, Jason and Melissa visited often. They called every few days. They checked on me. They brought groceries and helped with little repairs. I remember feeling grateful that despite losing my husband, I had not lost my family. But over time, those visits became less frequent. The phone calls grew shorter. Holidays started changing. One Thanksgiving, Jason said they were celebrating with Rachel's relatives because it was more convenient. The next Christmas, Melissa took a vacation out west and promised we would celebrate together later. Later never came. I made excuses for all of it. They were busy. They had careers. They had responsibilities. That is what parents do. We protect our children from blame even when the blame belongs there. Most evenings I sat alone in my living room with a cup of tea and a book resting on my lap. Sometimes I would look at old family photographs lined across the mantel. Smiling faces, birthday cakes, school graduations, summer cookouts. Looking at those pictures always made me feel rich, even when the house felt empty. The loneliness came gradually like a slow-moving fog. There was never one dramatic moment, just countless small absences, missed calls, forgotten invitations, delayed visits. Yet the moment I entered the hospital, something remarkable happened. Suddenly everyone had time. Suddenly everyone was available. Jason rearranged meetings. Melissa canceled plans. Rachel appeared almost daily. Their calendars had somehow opened the instant my health became uncertain. The realization settled heavily on me as I watched rain slide down the hospital window. For years, they had been too busy to spend an afternoon with their mother. Now they could not stay away. I wanted to believe their presence came from love. I truly did. But every conversation seemed to circle back to practical matters. Property, documents, accounts, insurance, the house. Always the house. Around midnight, a nurse quietly checked my monitors and asked if I needed anything. Her kindness felt genuine. After she left, I glanced at the framed photograph I kept on the bedside table. It showed Daniel standing beside me on our front porch 20 years earlier. We were smiling into the summer sun. Looking at that picture, I found myself wondering what he would think of everything happening now. And for the first time, a troubling question entered my mind. If my children were suddenly so interested in my future, why did it feel as though they were already planning a world without me in it? The following evening, I found it difficult to sleep. The hospital had settled into its nighttime rhythm. Distant footsteps echoed through the hallways. Machines hummed softly. Rain had stopped, leaving the world outside dark and still. I closed my eyes and tried to rest, but a quiet uneasiness lingered in the back of my mind. Around 10 o'clock, I heard familiar voices outside my room. At first, I assumed another family had visitors. Then I recognized Jason's voice. It was followed by Melissa's. I remained still. The door was nearly closed, and they seemed unaware that I was awake. The house alone has to be worth at least $600,000 now, Jason said quietly. There was a pause. Then Melissa responded. Maybe more. Property values around her neighborhood have gone up a lot. My eyes opened immediately. For a moment I thought I had misunderstood. I waited for one of them to mention my health, my treatment, or the doctor's update from earlier that afternoon. Instead, the conversation continued. Rachel joined in. The important thing is figuring out what paperwork exists. We need to know where everything stands. My heart sank. I remained perfectly still beneath the blanket. Years ago, when the children were young, I could always tell when they were hiding something. The same instinct returned now. The voices grew quieter, but I could still hear enough. They discussed insurance policies. They talked about taxes. They mentioned maintenance costs and future plans. Listening to them felt strangely unreal. It was as if I had disappeared from my own story and become an item on a checklist. Not once did anyone ask whether I would recover fully. Not once did anyone wonder what I wanted. The conversation eventually drifted farther down the hallway, and silence returned. I stared at the ceiling for a long time afterward. Part of me wanted to dismiss everything. Perhaps they were only being practical. Perhaps I was overreacting. Yet deep down I knew something had changed. Or perhaps something had finally been revealed. The next morning, Jason arrived carrying breakfast from a nearby cafe. He smiled warmly and placed the bag on the small table beside my bed. Melissa called me Mom, at least 6 times during a 15-minute visit. Rachel complimented the flowers in the room and asked how I was feeling. To anyone watching, they looked like devoted family members. But now I noticed details I had missed before. Their smiles appeared at the right moments. Their concerns sounded rehearsed. Their questions always found a way back to practical matters. I answered politely and revealed nothing. If they were hiding their true intentions, I decided I would do the same. That afternoon, after they left again, I sat quietly by the window watching sunlight break through the clouds for the first time in days. The parking lot below filled with visitors coming and going. Families arrived carrying balloons, cards, and gifts. Looking at them, I realized something painful. The hardest part was not hearing what my children had said outside my room. The The hardest part was realizing that I had already begun expecting it. Over the next 2 days, I stopped looking at my children the way a mother looks at her children and started looking at them the way a stranger might. It was a painful thing to admit, even to myself. Once I made that change, details began appearing everywhere. Jason spent more time checking his phone than speaking to me. Melissa asked whether I still kept records in the filing cabinet beside my desk at home. Rachel seemed unusually interested in the layout of the house, mentioning rooms and storage spaces that she had not seen in years. None of these things were alarming on their own. Together, they formed a picture I could no longer ignore. Lying in that hospital bed gave me something I had not had in a long time. Time to think. Time to remember. One memory after another surfaced. I remembered the birthday dinner 3 years earlier when everyone canceled at the last minute. Jason blamed work. Melissa blamed traffic. Rachel sent a brief text message wishing me well. I ended up eating a slice of cake alone at my kitchen table. At the time, I told myself it was not important. Then I remembered the Christmas gathering I learned about through photographs. Posted online. Everyone had been there. Smiling. Laughing. Exchanging gifts. I had not even known it was happening. Again, I made excuses for them. Looking back now, I wondered why. Another memory followed. The summer barbecue where Jason spent nearly an hour talking about real estate prices. He had walked through my house afterward, commenting on renovations that could increase its value. I remembered finding that conversation odd, but I quickly forgot about it. Now each memory felt like a puzzle piece sliding into place. The image they created was not flattering. It suggested that my absence had never troubled them as much as my assets interested them. Late that afternoon, a nurse named Claire entered my room to check my vital signs. She was warm, professional, and observant. We had exchanged small conversations over the previous few days. As she adjusted the blood pressure cuff around my arm, she glanced toward the hallway where my family had been standing earlier. "You have a lot of visitors," she said politely. I smiled faintly. "More than usual." Claire hesitated before speaking again. "I hope you do not mind me saying this, but most families spend their visits talking to the patient. Your family seems very interested in paperwork." The room fell quiet. Her words were gentle, but they landed with surprising weight. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then I laughed softly. Not because it was funny, because hearing the truth from someone else made it impossible to deny. Claire finished her work and wished me a pleasant evening. After she left, I sat quietly beside the window as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky turned shades of gold and gray. For years, I had ignored uncomfortable truths because accepting them felt too painful. Now the truth was sitting directly in front of me. And for the first time, instead of looking away, I decided I was going to face it. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I had not felt in years. My situation had not changed. I was still in a hospital bed. My children were still visiting. The uncertainty about their motives remained. Yet something inside me was different. For the first time, I stopped thinking like a disappointed mother and started thinking like the owner of my own life. Shortly after breakfast, Claire stopped by again. She checked my chart, adjusted a monitor, and asked how I was feeling. I told her the truth. Physically, I was improving. Emotionally, I was finally beginning to understand what was happening around me. She listened without interrupting. There was something comforting about her presence. She did not offer dramatic advice. She simply paid attention, which was more than I could say for most of my family lately. Later that afternoon, Jason arrived alone. He seemed unusually cheerful. He pulled a chair close to my bed and started talking about home maintenance. The conversation moved quickly from the weather to rising property taxes, and then to the condition of my house. He asked whether I had considered downsizing. He mentioned that managing a large home could become difficult as people grew older. I nodded and listened. Years earlier, I would have accepted every word at face value. Now I noticed how carefully each topic guided the conversation toward the same destination. Before leaving, he casually asked whether I still kept important documents in the study downstairs. The question sounded harmless, yet I felt the same quiet alarm I had experienced outside my room that night. After he left, I sat silently for several minutes. Then I reached for my phone. There was one person I needed to speak with. Thomas Bennett had been our family attorney for more than 20 years. He handled Daniel's estate after his passing and had always treated me with honesty and respect. I found his number in my contacts and called. When he answered, he sounded surprised but pleased to hear from me. We exchanged a few polite words before I asked whether he could visit me privately when his schedule allowed. There was a brief pause. Then he agreed without hesitation. We arranged a meeting for the following afternoon. I ended the call feeling something I had not felt since arriving at the hospital. Relief. Not because I suddenly had answers but because I had finally taken action. That evening Melissa and Rachel visited together. They brought magazines, snacks, and a small bouquet of fresh flowers. They appeared thoughtful and attentive. Yet as the conversation continued, familiar questions surfaced once again. Had I updated any legal documents recently? Did I still have the same safety deposit box? Was everything organized in case of emergencies? I smiled politely and answered very little. The less I revealed, the more curious they seemed to become. After they left, I watched the sun disappear beyond the hospital parking lot. The sky darkened. The lights in the hallway grew brighter. Somewhere nearby, a nurse laughed softly with a patient. For the first time since this began, I felt as though the balance was shifting. My children believed they were gathering information. What they did not realize was that I had started gathering my own. Thomas Bennett arrived the following afternoon carrying a worn leather briefcase that I recognized immediately. Seeing him walk into my hospital room felt like seeing a piece of my old life return. He shook my hand warmly and pulled a chair beside the bed. Unlike everyone else who had visited recently, he began with a simple question. He asked how I was feeling. The sincerity in those 4 words almost caught me off guard. After a few minutes of conversation, I explained why I had called. I told him about the sudden interest my children seemed to have in my affairs. I told him about the questions regarding documents, property records, insurance information, and legal arrangements. I even shared the conversation I had overheard outside my room. Thomas listened carefully without interrupting. His expression remained calm, though I noticed him making a few mental notes. When I finished, he folded his hands together and asked a question that lingered in the room. Had anyone recently asked me to sign documents that I had not fully reviewed? I thought for a moment. Then I remembered several occasions over the past 2 years. Jason had once suggested simplifying certain records. Rachel had mentioned updating paperwork to make things easier in the future. Melissa had encouraged me to organize my assets in case of emergencies. At the time, none of it seemed unusual. Thomas nodded slowly. He explained that there was nothing improper about discussing estate planning. However, he agreed that the timing and persistence of these conversations deserved attention. He then offered to review every legal document connected to my estate, property, and financial arrangements. The relief I felt was immediate. For days, uncertainty had surrounded me like a fog. Now I finally had someone helping me see clearly. Before leaving, Thomas assured me that nothing would be changed without my knowledge and consent. Those words mattered more than he probably realized. After he departed, I sat quietly replaying the conversation in my mind. A few hours later, Jason and Rachel arrived together. Their mood seemed unusually upbeat. They brought coffee and spoke about future plans. At one point, Jason mentioned that managing a large property alone could become stressful. Rachel agreed and casually suggested that families often benefited when major decisions were handled sooner rather than later. I listened politely. The difference was that now I heard every word differently. Their comments no longer sounded helpful. They sounded strategic. When Rachel asked whether I had spoken to anyone about updating my affairs, I smiled and told her that everything was under control. The brief look that passed between her and Jason lasted less than a second, but it was enough. They had expected information. Instead, they received uncertainty. That evening after they left, Claire stopped by to check on me. She noticed I seemed calmer than before. I told her that I finally felt prepared. Not because I knew exactly what was happening, but because I had stopped being a passive observer in my own life. As darkness settled outside the hospital window, I looked across the city lights and realized something important. Whatever my children were planning, they believed they were several steps ahead. What they did not know was that the game had already changed. The following 2 days brought a sudden change in my children's behavior. If I had not been paying attention, I might have mistaken it for affection. Jason called every morning before arriving at the hospital. Melissa started bringing homemade meals carefully packaged and labeled. Rachel appeared with magazines she thought I would enjoy and spent long stretches sitting beside my bed asking about old family memories. To anyone looking in from the outside, it would have seemed like a family drawing closer together during a difficult time. But once trust is broken, it becomes impossible to ignore certain patterns. The kindness always seemed to arrive immediately after a discussion about finances or future plans. The concern felt connected to information rather than emotion. I noticed how often they watched my reactions. Whenever the subject of the house surfaced, all three became especially attentive. It was as though they were searching for clues hidden inside ordinary conversations. One afternoon, Melissa sat beside me and held my hand. She spoke softly about how important family was. She reminded me that none of us knew what the future held. Then she carefully asked whether I had considered making things simpler for everyone by organizing my affairs sooner rather than later. The question was wrapped in warmth, but the purpose underneath felt familiar. I smiled and changed the subject. Her disappointment lasted only a second, but I saw it. Later that evening, Thomas called with an update. He had begun reviewing everything connected to my estate and property records. Nothing alarming had appeared so far, but he encouraged me to remain cautious and avoid signing anything without discussing it first. I promised him I would. After ending the call, I felt even more confident that I was making the right decision. The next morning, Claire stopped by before her shift became busy. She asked whether I was getting enough rest. I told her I was sleeping better than before. That surprised me because the situation itself had not improved. What had changed was my perspective. Fear grows when people feel powerless. I no longer felt powerless. I was watching, learning, paying attention. That afternoon, I overheard another conversation. This time it happened when Jason and Rachel stepped into the hallway, while believing I was asleep. Their voices were low, but not low enough. I caught fragments. Timelines. Property. Values. Future arrangements. Then one sentence stopped me cold. Rachel quietly said, "We just need to be patient." There was a brief silence before Jason answered, "Everything will work out eventually." The conversation ended there, but it told me everything I needed to know. They were not worried about me recovering. They were focused on what would happen afterward. For the first time, I felt no anger, only clarity. The truth was no longer hidden behind polite smiles and carefully chosen words. It was sitting in plain sight. That evening, I looked out at the city lights beyond my hospital window and thought about the house Daniel and I had built our lives around. For 40 years it had been a home. To my children, it now seemed to represent something entirely different. The realization was painful, but it also brought freedom. Because once you finally understand someone's intentions, you stop wasting energy trying to explain them away. 3 days later, my doctor entered the room with news I had been hoping to hear. My condition had improved enough for me to return home within the week. The moment that information became known, I noticed another shift in my family's behavior. Their concern became even more intense. Jason offered to stay at my house for a while to help me settle back in. Melissa volunteered to organize my medications and paperwork. Rachel suggested creating a complete inventory of everything in the house so that emergencies would be easier to manage in the future. Every offer sounded thoughtful. Every offer also happened to provide greater access to my personal affairs. By then, the pattern was impossible to ignore. That afternoon, Thomas visited again. He carried a folder containing copies of several documents and a summary of his review. We spoke privately for nearly an hour. He confirmed that my legal affairs were currently secure. Nothing had been changed without my authorization. However, he also pointed out that several conversations described by my children seemed unusually focused on future ownership rather than my present well-being. Hearing a professional say what I had already begun to suspect brought an unexpected sense of peace. I was no longer relying on feelings alone. I was relying on facts. Before leaving, Thomas and I discussed several options regarding my estate plan. I listened carefully. Then I made a decision that surprised even me. For years, I had avoided difficult choices because I feared conflict. Now I realized that avoiding conflict had not protected my family. It had only delayed reality. That evening, Jason arrived carrying takeout from one of my favorite restaurants. Melissa joined him an hour later. The atmosphere felt almost celebratory because everyone expected me to return home soon. During dinner, Jason casually mentioned that we should schedule a family meeting after my discharge. Melissa immediately agreed. Rachel smiled and said it would be a good opportunity to discuss future planning, while everyone was together. I nodded politely and told them that sounded like an excellent idea. The enthusiasm that followed was impossible to miss. For the first time since entering the hospital, I watched them become genuinely excited. Not emotional. Not relieved. Excited. They immediately began discussing dates and schedules. I remained quiet and listened. None of them noticed the small smile that appeared on my face. They believed the upcoming meeting would move events in the direction they wanted. They assumed they understood exactly what would happen next. What they did not know was that I had already arranged another meeting with Thomas for the day after my discharge. They also did not know that several important decisions had already been made. As darkness settled outside the window, I found myself thinking about Daniel again. He always believed that character revealed itself during moments of uncertainty. Looking back over the previous week, I realized how right he had been. People had shown me exactly who they were. And soon they were going to discover that I had been paying attention all along. 2 days after returning home, the family meeting finally arrived. The house looked exactly as it always had. The same front porch where Daniel and I drank coffee on summer mornings. The same dining room where birthdays and holidays had been celebrated for decades. Yet that evening everything felt different. Jason arrived first. Melissa followed shortly afterward. Rachel came carrying a dessert and a bright smile. They all seemed unusually cheerful. There was an energy in the room that felt less like a family gathering and more like anticipation. I welcomed everyone inside and invited them to sit at the dining table. A few minutes later, there was another knock at the door. Thomas Bennett stepped inside carrying a folder. The expressions around the table changed immediately. Nobody had expected him to be there. Jason looked surprised. Melissa glanced at Rachel. For a moment nobody spoke. Then I invited Thomas to take a seat beside me. The room grew quiet. I folded my hands on the table and thanked everyone for coming. Then I explained that after my recent health scare, I had spent a great deal of time thinking about the future. Every face around the table became attentive. This was clearly the moment they had been waiting for. Thomas opened the folder and placed several documents in front of him. I could almost feel the tension growing. Finally I spoke. I told them that I had reviewed my estate plans carefully. I told them that recent events had helped me understand what truly mattered. Then I shared my decision. The house would not be transferred to any individual family member. Instead, after my lifetime, it would be sold and the proceeds directed according to a new plan that reflected the values Daniel and I had always believed in. The silence that followed was immediate. Jason stared at me. Melissa looked completely caught off guard. Rachel's smile disappeared. Nobody seemed prepared for what they had just heard. After a few moments, Jason asked why I had made such a choice. His voice remained calm, but I could hear the disappointment beneath it. I looked at my children and answered honestly. I told them that a home is more than a financial asset. It represents love, memories, sacrifice, and time. I explained that during one of the most difficult weeks of my life, I learned a great deal about the difference between concern for a person and concern for their possessions. Nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. They simply listened. For the first time in years, I felt completely at peace. There was no anger in my voice. No desire for revenge. Only clarity. The meeting ended quietly. One by one, everyone left. When the front door finally closed and the house became still again, I walked into the living room and looked at the photograph of Daniel resting on the mantel. The evening sun filtered through the windows, filling the room with warm light. For years I had feared being alone. What I finally understood was that solitude is not the same as loneliness. Loneliness comes from feeling unseen by the people who should know your heart. That night, for the first time in a very long while, I felt seen. Most importantly, I had remembered something that no document, property record, or inheritance could ever measure. My life belonged to me, and so did my decisions. And that's the end of today's story. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories like this. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.